The moment the starborn vigil crossed the boundary, every alarm system in the Galactic Communication Network screamed at once. Relay stations that had been quietly monitoring the quarantine perimeter for thousands of years suddenly lit up with emergency signals. Automated warning beacons fired pulses in every direction. Deep space listening posts recorded the breach and forwarded the data to military command stations across 3 sectors. Within minutes, the news had reached the desks of admirals, counselors, and intelligence chiefs on 100 different worlds. Something had come out of Quarantine Zone Theta 9, and nobody knew what it was. On the bridge of the Vigil, Laura Webb's console erupted with incoming transmissions. Dozens of channels opened at once, filled with voices speaking languages she had never heard before. But underneath the noise, she could pick out patterns, structures she recognized from the Cathari linguistic databases she had spent years studying. The galaxy's languages had changed over 60,000 years, but many of them still carried traces of the Cathari trade tongue that had once been the common language of this part of space. I am getting signals from at least 12 different sources, Laura said, her hands flying across the console. Military frequencies, diplomatic channels, general broadcasts, they know we are here. Daniel stood at the center of the bridge and kept his voice level. Can you translate any of it? Give me a few minutes. I am building a bridge between the Cathari root language and what I am hearing now. It is like trying to read modern English when all you know is Old Norse, but there is enough overlap. Amy Lawson looked up from her tactical display. Captain, I am reading multiple fleet signatures converging on our position. 3 different groups, coming from 3 different directions. Estimated arrival, 90 minutes for the closest one. Weapons? Very heavy. Each group has enough firepower to glass a continent. Daniel took a breath. He had always known this moment would come. They had planned for it, trained for it, argued about it in late-night meetings back on Earth before the mission even launched. Admiral Hank Patterson had sat across from him in a dimly lit briefing room and said the same thing over and over. You will get one chance, one single chance, to show them what we are. Do not waste it. Hold position, Daniel said. No weapons, no shields. We sit here and we wait. Kyle Burton, standing at the back of the bridge, raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. His hand rested on the sidearm at his hip, out of habit, not intention. 90 minutes later, the first fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel and filled the Vigil's viewport with warships. They were unlike anything Daniel had ever seen. Long, elegant vessels with curving hulls that shimmered like polished bone, bristling with weapon arrays that pulsed with soft blue light. A second fleet arrived minutes later. This one made up of darker, heavier ships built like armored fists. The third fleet came last, and its vessels were stranger still, translucent and organic, as if they had been grown rather than built. 3 species, 3 fleets, all of them pointed at one small human cruiser sitting alone in the dark. Laura turned from her console. I have a working translation matrix. It is rough, but I can understand most of what they are saying. She paused. They are arguing about whether to destroy us. Wonderful, Amy muttered. Far away, on the Galactic Council's capital station, known as Citadel Orionis, High Arbiter Varathan was pulled from a diplomatic reception by a group of aides who could barely keep their composure. Varathan was old, even by the standards of his species, the Dravani. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, with a hard exoskeleton the color of dark iron, and 4 compound eyes that had seen more political crises than most species had years in their history. But when his aides told him what had happened, even he went still. Something has come out of the zone, he repeated, as if saying the words more slowly would make them less alarming. Yes, High Arbiter, a single vessel of unknown design. It is broadcasting signals, but we cannot identify the species. Varathan closed all 4 of his eyes for a long moment. Then he opened them and walked toward the council chamber. The emergency session was chaos. Hundreds of delegates from across the galaxy packed the amphitheater, shouting over each other in a dozen languages. Vorathan took his place at the high bench and let the noise wash over him until it began to die down on its own. He had learned long ago that silence was more commanding than any gavel. Ambassador Selkari of the Varathi was the first to speak formally. She was a tall, reptilian figure with scales the color of burnt copper and eyes like polished black stones. The Varathi were a military species, proud and cautious, and Selkari carried herself like a drawn blade. "The quarantine exists for a reason," she said, her voice cutting through the chamber. "We do not know what is on that ship. We do not know what diseases it carries, what weapons it has, or what intentions drive it. The only safe response is immediate destruction. Burn the vessel, reseal the breach, and reinforce the boundary so this never happens again." A murmur of agreement rippled through parts of the chamber. Fear was a powerful thing, and 60,000 years of ghost stories had made the quarantine zone the most terrifying place in the collective imagination of the galaxy. But then Counselor Thren of the Milari rose from her seat. Thren was small by the standards of the chamber, an aquatic species who wore a thin suit of flowing water over her blue-green skin so she could breathe in the station's atmosphere. Her voice was soft, but it carried. "The vessel is broadcasting communication signals," Thren said. "It is not attacking. It is not fleeing. It is sitting still and trying to talk to us. Before we destroy a ship that may contain thinking, feeling beings, I would like to invoke Article 12 of the Founding Compact." The chamber went quiet. Article 12 was old law, written into the original charter of the Council. It stated that any sapient species encountered for the first time had the right to speak before the full Council before any military action could be taken against them. It had not been invoked in over 4,000 years. Selkari's eyes narrowed. "You cannot be serious." "I am entirely serious," Thren replied. "The law is clear. If there is even a possibility that this vessel carries a sapient species, we are bound to hear them before we fire." Vorathan looked between the two of them. He could feel the weight of the chamber pressing down on him, hundreds of delegates waiting for his decision. He thought about the warnings on the obelisks, about the old stories, about all the things the galaxy had chosen to forget, and then he thought about what it would mean if they destroyed a ship full of innocent beings simply because they were afraid. "Article 12 is invoked," he said. "Send a message to the vessel. One representative, unarmed, is invited to address the Council." Back on the Vigil, Laura Webb received the transmission and decoded it. She read it twice to be sure, then turned to Daniel. "They want to talk. They are inviting one person to their station, unarmed and alone." Amy was on her feet immediately. "Absolutely not. It is a trap. They bring you in, they take you apart for study, and then they blow us up anyway." Daniel looked at her. He understood her fear. She had spent 3 years keeping this crew alive, and the thought of sending her captain into the hands of unknown aliens with overwhelming firepower went against every tactical instinct she had. "Amy," he said quietly, "we did not cross 60,000 years of silence to sit in this ship and say nothing. If they want to hear us, then I am going to go in there and make sure they hear every word." He turned to Laura. "Send the reply. I accept. If something goes wrong in there, you get this crew home. That is an order." Kyle met his eyes and nodded, just once, the way he always did. Daniel walked to the shuttle bay alone. He stripped his sidearm and left it on a shelf near the airlock. He checked his uniform, straightened his collar, and took one last look at the interior of his ship. The metal walls were scratched and dented from 3 years of hard travel. The lights flickered every now and then because the power grid had been patched so many times that the engineers had lost count. It was not a pretty ship, but it was his, and it had carried humanity further than anyone had ever gone. He climbed into the shuttle, sealed the hatch, and launched. The flight to Citadel Orionis took 40 minutes. As the station grew on his viewport, Daniel felt his breath catch. It was enormous. Built into the hollowed core of an asteroid, it stretched across his entire field of vision, covered in lights and docking towers and the glinting shapes of thousands of ships. He had seen pictures of Earth's largest cities from orbit, and they looked like villages compared to this. Alien warships flanked his shuttle on every side, guiding him toward a docking port. He could feel their weapons tracking him. He could feel the weight of every eye in the galaxy turning toward this one small shuttle carrying one human being into a place no human had ever been. He set the shuttle down, opened the hatch, and stepped out into air that smelled like nothing he had ever breathed before. A wall of armed guards stood waiting for him. Behind them, a corridor stretched into the depths of the station, lit by soft light that shifted colors in patterns he did not understand. Daniel Grant straightened his back, took a breath, and walked forward to meet the galaxy. The guards did not speak to him. They walked in a tight formation around Daniel, their weapons held at angles that looked casual, but were not. He counted 12 of them, representing at least 5 different species. One was a towering insectoid with dark iron plating on its body, similar in shape to the Dravani he had seen in the data files Laura Webb had assembled from intercepted broadcasts. 2 were reptilian, their scales dull green under the shifting light of the corridor, and they watched him with unblinking black eyes. 3 were creatures he had no reference for at all, beings made of what looked like living crystal, their bodies catching the light and throwing small rainbows across the walls as they moved. Daniel kept his hands visible at his sides, and his pace steady. Admiral Hank Patterson's voice echoed in his memory. "Show them you are not afraid, but never show them you are a threat." It had sounded simple in a briefing room back on Earth. It was considerably harder when you were walking unarmed through an alien space station the size of a small country, surrounded by soldiers who might decide at any moment that you were better off dead. The corridor opened into a wider passage lined with windows that looked out onto the interior of the station. Daniel slowed for just a moment, and what he saw through those windows took his breath away. The hollowed asteroid was not empty. It was a city. Towers rose from every surface, some growing upward, some hanging down from the ceiling, some extending sideways from the walls in ways that defied every architectural instinct Daniel had. Between the towers, thousands of small vehicles and flying creatures moved through the open air, weaving between bridges and platforms in patterns that somehow never collided. He saw parks filled with vegetation in colors he had no names for. He saw plazas where dozens of species walked together, each one different from the last. The sheer scale of it, the sheer variety of life, made him feel very small and very alone. But he kept walking. The council chamber was at the heart of the station, carved from the raw rock of the asteroid itself. The guards led Daniel through a pair of massive doors that opened without a sound, and he stepped into a space that dwarfed anything he had ever stood inside. The chamber was shaped like a bowl, with rows of seats rising in every direction around a central platform. Hundreds of delegates filled those seats. Some were enormous, taking up 3 or 4 spaces. Some were so small he could barely see them. Some floated in tanks of liquid. Some hovered in the air, on wings or fields of energy he did not understand. And every single one of them was looking at him. Daniel walked to the central platform. His boots made a soft sound on the stone floor, and in the silence of the chamber, that sound seemed very loud. He stopped at the center, stood straight, and waited. High Arbiter Vorathan looked down at him from the high bench. The old Dravani's 4 compound eyes studied Daniel with an expression that was impossible to read. When he spoke, his voice filled the chamber through some kind of amplification system that made it sound like it was coming from everywhere at once. You have crossed the boundary of Quarantine Zone Theta 9, a region sealed by this council's predecessors 60,000 years ago. You are charged with breaching a sovereign quarantine. Before any action is taken, you have been granted the right to speak under Article 12 of the Founding Compact. State your name, your species, and your purpose. Daniel had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his head during the shuttle ride over. He had thought about grand speeches, about dramatic declarations, about the kind of words that would look good in a history book. But standing here, under the gaze of a galaxy that did not know his kind existed, he decided that the truth was enough. My name is Daniel Grant. I am a human being from a world called Earth. My species evolved inside the quarantine zone, on a planet that was once a colony of a civilization called the Cathari. We did not choose to be born inside a cage. We did not know the cage existed until we reached the stars and found the walls you built around us. He paused, letting Laura Webb's translation matrix carry his words to every delegate in the chamber. Humans are young compared to the species I see in this room. We have been building ships capable of traveling between stars for less than 200 years. But we are not ignorant. We found the Cathari ruins on our neighboring worlds. We studied them. We learned what the Cathari were, what they built, and how they died. And we learned that this quarantine was put in place to contain a plague that killed the Cathari and threatened to spread to the rest of the galaxy. He took a steady breath. That plague is gone. It burned itself out tens of thousands of years before my species even learned to make fire. We carry no trace of it. We are not Cathari. We are not their weapon. We are simply people who grew up in a locked room and spent our entire history trying to find the door. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then Ambassador Selkari stood. Her copper scales caught the light as she descended from her seat to a speaking platform opposite Daniel. Her black eyes were fixed on him with an intensity that made the air between them feel like it had weight. "A touching story," she said, and her tone made it clear she did not find it touching at all. "But stories are easy to tell. You say the plague is gone? Prove it. You say you carry no trace of Cathari biology? Prove it. You say your intentions are peaceful. Prove that too, if you can." Daniel had expected this. He touched the small communication device in his ear, the one Laura had fitted before he left the vigil, and spoke quietly. "Nathan, she wants proof. Send everything." Back on the Starbound vigil, Dr. Nathan Cole had been sitting at the science station with every relevant file already open and ready. He transmitted the data to Laura, who relayed it through the translation matrix and projected it onto the holographic display in the center of the council chamber. The display showed genetic analyses, biological comparisons, atmospheric samples, and 60,000 years of epidemiological data gathered from Cathari medical archives. Nathan had spent the better part of 3 years compiling this evidence, cross-referencing it, and verifying it against every standard he could find. It was, in his professional opinion, bulletproof. Daniel gestured to the display. "This is the biological data. The Cathari plague was a genetically targeted pathogen. It attacked a specific protein structure found only in Cathari cells. Humans do not have that structure. Neither does any species whose genetic information we have been able to intercept from your public communication signals. The plague is extinct. It has been extinct for longer than most of the civilizations in this room have existed." Selkari studied the data with the focused attention of someone looking for a flaw. She asked questions. Sharp, precise, technical questions that showed she understood biology far better than Daniel did. He relayed each one to Nathan, who answered through Laura, and the answers appeared on the display in real time. After 20 minutes of cross-examination, Selkari fell silent. She had not found the flaw she was looking for, and the entire chamber knew it. She returned to her seat without another word, but Daniel could see in her posture that she was not finished. She was regrouping, not retreating. The chamber erupted into noise. Delegates argued with each other in clusters, some pointing at the data on the display, others pointing at Daniel. He stood in the middle of it all and waited, because there was nothing else he could do. During a recess, Counselor Thren approached him. She moved through a thin envelope of water that flowed around her body, and up close, Daniel could see that her skin was covered in tiny bioluminescent spots that pulsed in soft blues and greens. She spoke quietly, and the translation came through his earpiece a half-second behind her words. "You did well, but I need to tell you something the rest of the council will not." Daniel looked at her. "I am listening." The quarantine was not only about the plague. The original council sealed the zone because they were afraid of what might come after the Cathari. The Cathari were the most powerful species this galaxy had ever seen. They built things that the rest of us still cannot understand. The council's founders were terrified that another species might evolve in the Cathari's ruins, learn from their technology, and become something even more dangerous. The plague was the excuse. Fear was the reason. Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest. So even if I prove the plague is harmless, they might still vote to lock us back in. Selkari will argue for exactly that. She is building a coalition right now. She does not care about the plague. She cares about what humans might become. Daniel was quiet for a moment, and he looked at Thren. "What do you think?" Thren's bioluminescent spots flickered in a pattern he could not read. "I think that a species that sends one unarmed man to face the entire galaxy is either very foolish or very brave. I have not decided which one yet." She turned and moved back to her seat, leaving Daniel alone on the platform. He pressed his earpiece. "Amy, are you there?" Amy Lawson's voice came back immediately. "I am here, Captain. I need you to prepare the ship for anything. Do not power up weapons. Do not raise shields. But make sure everyone is at their station and ready to move." "Understood. Daniel, how bad is it in there?" He looked out at the hundreds of alien faces staring at him from every direction. Some were curious. Some were hostile. Some were afraid. All of them were waiting to decide whether his species deserved to exist outside a cage. "It is not over yet," he said, "but it is not over yet." He lowered his hand from his ear and straightened his back. The recess was ending. Vorathen was raising his hand for silence. Daniel had spoken the truth. He had shown the evidence. And now he had to stand in the center of a room full of strangers and hope that truth and evidence were enough. The vote came faster than Daniel expected, and it did not go the way he had hoped. Selkari had been busy during the recess. She had moved through the chamber like a blade through silk, speaking quietly to delegates from species that bordered the quarantine zone, species that had the most to fear if something dangerous had emerged from inside. She reminded them of the old stories. She reminded them of the obelisk warnings. She reminded them that the Cathari had been powerful enough to engineer stars, and that any species that grew up in their ruins might carry echoes of that power. She did not need to lie. The truth was frightening enough. When Vorathen called the session back to order, Selkari rose and proposed a formal resolution. She called it a containment action. The language was clean and diplomatic, but the meaning was simple. The Starbound Vigil would be seized. Its crew would be taken into custody for biological study. The breach in the quarantine would be resealed with upgraded defenses, and no further contact with the species inside the zone would be permitted. The vote passed by a margin of 42 seats. Not overwhelming, but enough. Vorathen announced the result with a heaviness in his voice that Daniel thought might have been regret. Guards moved toward the platform where Daniel stood. Out in the dark of space, a Vorathi battle group broke formation and set an intercept course for the starborn Vigil. On the bridge of the Vigil, Amy Lawson saw them coming. Her tactical display lit up with threat indicators, red markers closing in from the port side at speeds that made her stomach drop. She opened a channel to every station on the ship. All hands, battle stations, this is not a drill. Kyle Burton was in the Marine barracks when the call came. He had his armor on within 90 seconds, and his squad assembled within 2 minutes. They moved to their positions throughout the ship, covering airlocks, engineering, and the bridge itself. Kyle took his place next to Amy and looked at the display. "How many?" he asked. 14 warships, 3 heavy cruisers, 6 destroyers, 5 frigates. Each one outguns us by a factor of at least 10. Kyle was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the Marines, standing at stations around the bridge. They were tired. They were far from home. And every single one of them was ready. "If it comes to it," he said to Amy, quiet enough that only she could hear, "we make sure they remember us." Amy shook her head. "The captain said no weapons, no shields. The captain is on a station surrounded by people who just voted to lock us up. And he gave us an order." Kyle's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Orders were orders, and Daniel Grant had earned the right to give them. On Citadel Orionis, the guards reached Daniel. He held up his hands, not in surrender, but in a gesture that asked them to wait. He looked up at Vorathan. "High Arbiter, I have one more thing to show this council. I invoke the right of final testimony under Article 12. Selkari stood immediately. "Article 12 has been satisfied." He spoke, we listened, and the council has voted. But Thren was already on her feet. "Article 12 grants the right of final testimony after a vote. It is the accused species' right to present a closing statement before any enforcement action is carried out. The law is clear." Vorathan looked at Thren, then at Selkari, then at Daniel. The old Dravani was tired. Daniel could see it in the way his 4 eyes blinked out of sync, a sign of exhaustion in his species. But there was something else in his expression too. Curiosity. The same curiosity that had made him side with Thren in the first place. "The right is granted," Vorathan said. "Make it count." The guards stepped back. Daniel returned to the speaking platform and pressed his earpiece. "Laura, I need the Kethari archive data. All of it. The full projection." Laura Webb's voice came back, steady and precise. "Transmitting now, Captain." The holographic display in the center of the chamber flickered and then expanded into something that made the entire room go still. It was not a simple data chart this time. It was a map. A vast, detailed, 3-dimensional map of everything humans had found in the deepest vaults of the Kethari civilization during their 3 years inside the quarantine zone. Daniel let the image hang in the air for a moment. Then he spoke. "During our journey through the zone, my crew explored over 40 Kethari installations. Most of them were ruins, dead cities, collapsed laboratories, empty shipyards. But in 6 of those installations, we found something that was not dead. The Kethari knew they were dying. They knew their plague would consume them. And before the end, they built vaults. Not tombs, not monuments, seed banks. They stored everything they had learned, everything they had built, everything they believed might be useful to whoever came after them." He pointed to the first cluster on the map. Clean energy reactors. The Kethari solved the problem of limitless power generation 40,000 years before any civilization in this chamber existed. The designs are complete, functional, and scalable to any technology level. He pointed to the second cluster. Medical nanites. Microscopic machines capable of repairing cellular damage, curing genetic disorders, and eliminating diseases. My science officer tells me that at least 3 of the diseases currently ravaging Council worlds have direct analogs in the Cathari medical database, and the cures are already designed. He pointed to the third cluster, methods for growing food in any environment, from vacuum to deep ocean, with yields that would end famine on any world that adopted them. And this, a navigational archive. The Cathari mapped regions of space that the Council has never been able to explore. Safe routes through nebulae, past black holes, around radiation zones. Thousands of star systems that no living species has ever visited. The chamber was completely silent. Every delegate stared at the map floating in the air above them. Even Selkari had gone still, her black eyes reflecting the light of the holographic display. Daniel lowered his hand. We found all of this. My crew, 153 people on one ship, spent 3 years cataloging it. We could have kept it. We could have used the Cathari energy technology to build a fleet. We could have used their weapons research, and yes, they had weapons research, to arm that fleet. We could have blasted through the quarantine boundary with enough firepower to make your sentinels look like toys, and we could have come out fighting. He paused and looked around the chamber, meeting as many eyes as he could. But that is not who we are. We did not come here to conquer. We came here to join. And we are offering all of this, every piece of it, freely. No conditions, no payments, no leverage, freely, to the entire Council. He took one breath. All we ask in return is what should never have been taken from us. Recognition as a sovereign species, full membership in this Council, and the permanent dissolution of the quarantine that kept us in the dark for 60,000 years. The silence that followed was the deepest Daniel had ever experienced. It was the silence of hundreds of minds processing something they had not expected, something that did not fit into the story they had told themselves about the quarantine zone. Selkari broke it. She stood slowly and spoke in a voice that was carefully controlled. This could be fabricated. The data could be false. The technology could be designed to fail or to destroy. But Thren stood as well, and this time her voice was not soft. Then verify it, test it, study it, but do not destroy the people who brought it to us. Captain Grant is right. If humans wanted war, they had the tools to wage one. Instead, they sent one ship, one captain, and an open hand. That is not the act of a threat. That is the act of a neighbor. In the space beyond the station, the Varathi battle group reached weapons range of the Starbound Vigil. Amy Lawson watched the targeting locks appear on her display. Kyle Burton's Marines stood at their stations, silent and ready. The ship hummed with tension, every system running, every person holding their breath. Amy kept her hand flat on the console. She did not touch the weapons controls. She thought about Daniel, alone on that station, trusting his crew to hold the line, and she held it. Back in the chamber, Vorathan called for a new vote. Selkari opposed it, arguing that the first vote was binding. But the founding compact was clear. Final testimony could reopen a vote if new evidence was presented, and the Cathari archive was the most significant new evidence the Council had seen in generations. The delegates voted. The tally was slow, each species casting in turn, each number appearing on the display above the chamber. Daniel watched, his hands at his sides, his face giving away nothing, even as his heart pounded hard enough that he could feel it in his temples. The resolution passed by 3 votes. The containment action was rescinded. The quarantine was to be dissolved. Humanity was to be granted provisional recognition pending a formal review. 3 votes, the margin between a cage and a future. On the vigil, Amy saw the Varathi fleet slow, stop, and begin to pull back. The targeting locks disappeared one by one. She let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like an hour. Kyle looked at the tactical display, now clear of red markers, and unclenched his fists. He keyed the intercom to the Marine barracks. "Stand down," he said. "We made it." In the council chamber, Thren crossed the floor to Daniel and stopped in front of him. Her bioluminescent spots pulsed in a pattern that the translation matrix could not interpret. But Daniel thought it might have been something like a smile. "3 votes," she said. "You are either the luckiest species in the galaxy, or the most stubborn." Daniel looked at her, and for the first time since he had boarded the shuttle, he let himself smile. "In my experience, those are usually the same thing." 3 months after the vote, the quarantine buoys began going dark. One by one, the ancient machines that had sealed an entire arm of the galaxy for 60,000 years were powered down and towed away by joint human and council engineering teams. Each deactivation was broadcast live across the Galactic Communication Network, and billions of beings on hundreds of worlds watched as the wall came down. For most of them, it was the first time they had seen anything from inside the zone. And what they saw was not a wasteland of plague and ruin. It was stars. Ordinary, beautiful stars, no different from the ones on their side of the boundary. The first human ships to cross into Council space after the vote were not warships. They were survey vessels, small and lightly armed, carrying scientists and cartographers whose job was to map safe routes between Earth and the nearest Council trade lanes. They moved carefully, following protocols that Laura Webb had negotiated with the Council's navigation authority. And at every checkpoint, they were met by alien observers who boarded the ships, scanned the equipment, and confirmed that nothing dangerous was being transported. It was slow work, and Daniel Grant found it frustrating in a way that surprised him. After 3 years of flying through the unknown, he had expected the hard part to be over. Instead, the hard part had simply changed shape. It was no longer about dodging sentinel drones and rationing food. It was about forms, procedures, diplomatic language, the endless, grinding patience of convincing a galaxy full of strangers that you were safe to be around. Admiral Hank Patterson arrived 8 weeks after the buoys came down. He came aboard the heavy cruiser Columbia, leading a small flotilla of 3 diplomatic vessels and 2 escort frigates. Patterson was a compact man in his early 60s, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from a particularly stubborn piece of wood. He had spent 30 years in the fleet, and another 10 planning the mission that had sent the Starbound Vigil into the zone. And when he stepped onto Citadel Orionis for the first time, he stood in the docking bay for a full minute without speaking, just looking. Daniel met him at the airlock. Patterson studied him, then shook his hand firmly. "You look tired," Patterson said. "I have been doing politics," Daniel replied. "That explains it." The formal ceremony was held in the council chamber. Patterson presented Earth's credentials to High Arbiter Vorathan in front of the full assembly. The document was simple by council standards: a statement of identity, a declaration of peaceful intent, and a formal request for membership. Vorathan accepted it with a nod and a few words that the translation matrix rendered as something close to welcome, though with a note of caution. The provisional status meant that humanity would be observed for a standard galactic year before full membership was confirmed. It was not ideal, but Daniel had argued successfully that it was better than fighting the point and losing allies. Daniel himself was appointed as humanity's first ambassador to Citadel Orionis. The title sounded grand. The reality was a small office on a lower level of the station, with a window that looked out onto a ventilation shaft. He spent his days in meetings with delegates who ranged from genuinely curious to openly hostile, navigating cultural customs he did not fully understand, and eating food that his body was not always sure about. He missed the clarity of having a course to fly and a crew at his back. But he did the work, because the work mattered. Amy Lawson was promoted to full commander and given the captain's chair on the Starbound Vigil. The ship was brought into a council dry dock for refitting, and when it came out, it carried a mix of human and council technology that made it faster, tougher, and more capable than anything Earth had built on its own. Amy ran her hand along the new hull plating on the day the refit was completed, and felt the hum of alien power systems running alongside the familiar vibration of human engines. It was strange and wonderful, and a little frightening all at the same time. Her first mission as captain was a deep space exploration run into one of the uncharted regions mapped in the Cathari Navigational Archive. She took a mixed crew, mostly human, but with a small team of Milari scientists and a Dravani engineering consultant. It was the first joint mission between humans and council species, and both sides spent the first week being very polite and very careful around each other. By the third week, they were arguing about the best way to calibrate the sensors, and Amy considered that real progress. Dr. Nathan Cole established the Cathari Archive Research Institute on a neutral station in the space between Earth's territory and the nearest council border. The station was chosen precisely because it belonged to no one, a deliberate signal that the knowledge inside the archive was meant for everyone. Within the first month, scientists from 14 species had applied for research positions. Nathan hired as many as the station could hold and began the slow, painstaking work of translating Cathari technology into forms that modern civilizations could use. The Cathari medical nanites, once decoded and adapted, proved effective against a degenerative nerve disease that had plagued the Varathi for centuries. The treatment was distributed freely, exactly as Daniel had promised, and when the first wave of patients began to recover, something shifted in the way the galaxy talked about humans. They were no longer the strange creatures from the Forbidden Zone. They were the people who brought the cure. Nathan watched the reports come in from Varathi hospitals and allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. He called Daniel that evening and said, with the dry humor that was the only kind he had, "Nothing builds friendships faster than curing a plague that has killed millions." Kyle Burton was reassigned to a security detail, protecting human diplomats on council stations. He traded his combat armor for a dress uniform that he hated with a passion that bordered on personal. The uniform was stiff, the collar was too tight, and the shoes made a ridiculous clicking sound on the station's stone floors. But the job itself was simpler than anything he had done in years. No hostile territory, no automated defense platforms, no 40-minute countdowns with the fate of the species hanging in the balance. Just standing near doorways and looking intimidating, which Kyle was naturally very good at. He ran into Thren one afternoon in a corridor near the diplomatic wing. She looked at his uniform, and her bioluminescent spots flickered in what he had learned to recognize as amusement. "You look uncomfortable," she said. "I am," he agreed. "You prefer the armor." "I prefer anything that does not have buttons." Thren made a sound that might have been a laugh. Kyle decided he liked the Milari. Laura Webb became the most sought-after linguist in council space. Her translation matrix, built from Cathari root languages and refined through months of immersion in living alien tongues, became the foundation for a new universal communication protocol. The council's old translation systems were clumsy and full of gaps. Laura's system was faster, more accurate, and capable of handling the subtle emotional registers that species like the Milari used in their bioluminescent speech. She published the protocol openly, and within a year, it was adopted as the standard for all first contact scenarios. She never got used to being famous. She still preferred her console on the Vigil to any lecture hall. And whenever Amy brought the ship back to Citadel Orionis for resupply, Laura would find an excuse to visit the bridge and sit in her old chair for a few minutes, just to remember what it felt like. Selkari never warmed to humans entirely. She watched their integration into council society with the cautious skepticism of someone who had spent her entire career preparing for threats. But she was not dishonest, and when the Cathari medical technology proved genuine and effective, She acknowledged it publicly. In a private meeting with Daniel, months after the vote, she told him something he never forgot. The galaxy has not seen a species rise this fast since the Cathari, she said. I hope your kind proves wiser than they were. Daniel met her eyes. Wisdom is a work in progress. But humans have a stubborn habit of learning from mistakes. It takes us a while sometimes, but we get there. Selkari studied him for a long moment. Then she gave a single sharp nod, the Varathi equivalent of respect, and left the room. Thren became humanity's strongest ally on the Council. She sponsored trade agreements between the Malari and Earth, opened her people's universities to human students, and personally championed the joint exploration missions that sent human and alien crews into the unknown together. When Daniel asked her once why she had sided with humanity from the very beginning, she told him it was because she had read the Cathari obelisk warnings more carefully than most. The warnings say to fear what comes from the zone, she said. But they also say that the greatest danger is a galaxy that refuses to grow. I decided I would rather take the risk. The story closes on a quiet evening, 6 months after the quarantine fell. Daniel stood on an observation deck on the upper ring of Citadel Orionis, looking out through a panoramic window at the arm of the galaxy that had once been his prison. The stars there looked the same as they did from the other side. They always had. A young Dravani child, barely tall enough to reach Daniel's elbow, wandered over and tugged at his sleeve. The child's caretaker hurried after, apologizing in rapid clicks that the translation matrix rendered as embarrassed concern. Daniel waved the caretaker off with a smile. The child looked up at him with wide compound eyes and asked the question in simple, halting words that the earpiece translated a moment later. What was it like inside the zone? Daniel knelt down so he was level with the child. He thought about the 3 years of darkness, the cold between the stars, the ruins of a civilization that had destroyed itself, and the long, desperate flight toward a wall that might never have opened. He thought about Burton cutting through alien metal while the clock ran down. He thought about Amy holding the line while warships pointed their weapons at her hull. He thought about Nathan in his lab, building the proof that would save them. He thought about Laura, turning silence into words. It was dark for a very long time, he said, but we kept building until we found the door. The child considered this with the seriousness that only very young beings can bring to a simple answer. Then the child nodded, apparently satisfied, and wandered back to the caretaker. Daniel stood up and turned back to the window. Behind him, the station hummed with the sound of 1,000 species living alongside each other. In front of him, beyond the glass, the stars stretched out in every direction, open and endless. A convoy appeared at the edge of his vision. Human ships and council ships flying in formation, their engines glowing in the dark. They reached the jump point, aligned their drives, and in a flash of light they were gone, leaping together into the open galaxy for the first time. Daniel watched the light fade and stood there for a while longer, alone with the stars and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the door was open and it was never going to close again. 60,000 years before any living creature in the Galactic Council could remember, the leaders of that age made a decision that would echo across time. They sealed an entire arm of the Milky Way behind a wall of gravitational buoys and automated sentinel drones. They called it Quarantine Zone Theta 9, and they taught every child on every world the same story. Nothing that goes in comes back out. Nothing inside should ever be allowed to leave. The reasons were buried under layers of redacted records and destroyed archives. All that remained were stone obelisks floating in orbit around the boundary, covered in warnings written in a language so old that no living species could read it anymore. The zone became a ghost story, a thing parents used to frighten children into obedience. And over thousands of years, the galaxy simply agreed to forget what was locked inside. Something had grown. On the bridge of the deep space cruiser Starbound Vigil, Captain Daniel Grant stood with his boots planted on the deck, and his hands clasped behind his back. The viewport in front of him showed nothing but the endless dark of space, dotted with the cold light of distant stars. But his eyes were locked on the navigation display to his right, where a cluster of faint energy signatures pulsed in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Those signatures had been theoretical for most of his adult life. Now they were real, and they were close. "Laura," he said without turning around, "tell me that is what I think it is." Specialist Laura Webb sat at the communications console, her fingers moving across 3 different screens at once. She had spent the last 2 years learning dead languages from ruins on frozen moons. And now, all of that work came down to a single reading on her display. She looked at the data, looked again, and then allowed herself a small breath of relief. "It matches the models, Captain. Those are quarantine boundary buoys. We are less than 6 hours out." The bridge went quiet for a moment. 3 years. They had been flying through the interior of the quarantine zone for 3 years, surviving on recycled air and rationed food, dodging radiation storms, and navigating around dead worlds that still glowed with the residue of ancient wars. The Starbound Vigil had left Earth's orbit with a full crew of 162 people. They had lost 9 along the way. Every person on that ship carried the weight of those 9 names. And every person on that ship had asked themselves the same question at least once during the long nights between the stars. Was it worth it? Daniel turned and looked at his crew. Lieutenant Commander Amy Lawson sat at the tactical station, her jaw set and her eyes sharp. She had kept them alive through encounters with automated defense platforms that should have torn them apart. Sergeant Kyle Burton stood near the back of the bridge in his marine armor, arms crossed, watching everything with the calm patience of a man who had learned to sleep with one eye open. Dr. Nathan Cole leaned against the science station, reading data off a tablet, his expression the careful blank of someone who was thinking very hard about something very complicated. "War room, 10 minutes, Daniel said. "All senior staff." The war room was a narrow compartment behind the bridge, with a long metal table and a holographic projector bolted to the ceiling. Daniel sat at the head. Amy took the seat to his left. Kyle leaned against the wall because he never liked sitting in briefings. Nathan stood at the projector and pulled up a 3-dimensional map of the quarantine zone. "Here is what we know." He spoke in the calm, measured tone of a man who had spent his career studying things that had been dead for thousands of centuries. The quarantine zone was not built to contain humans. It was built to contain a species called the Cathari. They were, by every measure we have found in their ruins, the most advanced civilization this galaxy has ever produced. They built cities in the cores of gas giants. They engineered stars. And roughly 62,000 years ago, they created a biological weapon, a plague, designed to wipe out a rival species. The plague mutated. It turned on the Cathari themselves. Within 3 generations, they were gone. He tapped the projector, and the map zoomed out to show the boundary buoys ringing the entire arm of the galaxy. The Galactic Council of that era sealed the zone to prevent the plague from spreading. It worked. The plague burned itself out within a few thousand years because it had no more Cathari hosts to infect. But the Council never reopened the zone. They never checked. They just left it sealed, and over time, the records explaining why were lost or destroyed. "And then we showed up," Amy said. "And then we showed up," Nathan agreed. "Humanity evolved on a world that was once a Cathari colony. We found their ruins on Mars, on Europa, on 3 moons in the outer system. We learned from their technology. We built our own ships, and eventually we reached the boundary and realized we were living inside a cage." Daniel folded his hands on the table. What about the plague? Is it still a threat? Nathan shook his head. The plague was genetically targeted. It attacked Cathari biology specifically. It cannot infect humans, and based on the genetic data we have gathered from Council communication signals over the years, it cannot infect any known species in the galaxy. It is dead. It has been dead for tens of thousands of years. Amy, what are we looking at on the other side of that boundary? Amy pulled up the tactical overlay. The buoys appeared as a chain of red dots stretching across the display. Between each pair of buoys, a network of sentinel drones patrolled in slow, predictable patterns. The buoys generate a gravitational interference field. We cannot fly through it. But the sentinels are old. We are talking about machines that have been running on automated maintenance cycles for 60,000 years. Some of them are barely functional. If we can physically disable one buoy, we can create a gap wide enough for the Vigil to slip through before the network compensates. Kyle pushed off the wall. My team can do it. We take a shuttle, dock on the buoy, cut the power relays. 40 minutes, maybe less. Daniel looked at him. Kyle Burton was not a man who made promises lightly. He was built like a wall, and had the scars to prove that walls sometimes got hit very hard. But he also had the steady hands, and the clear thinking that kept his squad alive in situations that should have killed them twice over. 40 minutes, Daniel said. That is your window. If the buoy is not down in 40 minutes, you pull out and we find another way. Kyle nodded once. That was all he ever needed to do. The next 6 hours passed in tense preparation. Kyle briefed his Marine squad in the cargo bay, checking weapons and cutting tools and vacuum suits with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this kind of work before. Laura Webb monitored the Sentinel patrol patterns and fed timing updates to the shuttle. Nathan ran final checks on the plague data, making absolutely sure his conclusions were solid, because he knew that the first question any alien species would ask was whether humans were carrying death with them. Daniel stood on the bridge and watched the boundary buoys grow larger on the sensors. Behind those buoys was a galaxy full of species that did not know humans existed. A galaxy that had locked the door and thrown away the key, and never once wondered if someone new might be knocking from the other side. The shuttle launched. Kyle's voice came through the comm, calm and professional. Vigil, this is Burton. We are on approach. Docking in 4 minutes. Daniel gripped the railing in front of the viewport. Amy's hand rested on the tactical console, ready to raise shields or spin up weapons at the first sign of trouble. Laura kept her eyes on the communication channels, listening for any change in the Sentinel chatter. Nathan stood behind Daniel, holding his tablet to his chest like a shield. The shuttle reached the buoy. It was enormous up close. A dark metal sphere, the size of a small moon, covered in symbols that had not been read in 60,000 years. Kyle's team latched on, cut through the outer hull, and began working their way toward the power core. 30 minutes passed, then 35. Daniel's jaw tightened. Amy's fingers twitched over her console. At 38 minutes, Kyle's voice broke the silence. Vigil, power relays are cut. The buoy is going dark. On the sensor display, one red dot flickered and went out. A gap appeared in the boundary wall. It was narrow, and it would not last long, but it was there. Daniel straightened his back and looked at his crew. 3 years of darkness, of silence, of flying through the ruins of a dead civilization, while the rest of the galaxy pretended they did not exist. All of it came down to this moment. "Take us through," he said. The starborn Vigil surged forward, engines burning bright against the black. And for the first time in 60,000 years, something alive crossed the boundary of Quarantine Zone Theta 9 and entered the open galaxy.